So welcome everyone to the third lesson of this course, in which we're going to be talking about 7 basic camera movements that you can perform with your smartphone or any camera, to be honest, that will elevate your videography game. Now, as I note, before we start with this lecture right here, I want to make sure that you understand that the same camera movements that we're going to be talking about in this lesson right here can be actually implicated in post-production, and I'm going to teach you how to apply the same movements in post-production in future lessons. That being said, let's open the first slide and let's dive into this third lesson of the course. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be the basic outline of this lesson right here. We're going to start by me introducing you to those 7 basic camera movements and what we're going to talk about in this lesson right here. Then we're going to move into those 7 different shots and analyze each and every one of them, as well as I'm going to give you some examples for each and every one of those shots that we're going to analyze. Then some tips when it comes to actually applying those camera movements to your videography. And then, of course, we're going to have a small recap because it's a lot of information packed in this lesson right here. So let's start with the introduction. Now, what are camera movements and why do we use camera movements in our videography, in our filmmaking? Well, camera movements is basically a filmmaking technique that help us with the enhancement of our story. Pretty much the human eye is made to actually see movement, so movement intrigues the human eye, and movements, different camera movements and a wide variety of camera movements actually help the story to become more immersive and help with the engagement of the audience. And in general, in this business, audience engagement is very, very important. This is why I added this GIF right here, because moving again in those slides make the audience more interested in your videos. Now, in the following slides, we're going to break down the basic types of camera movement in filmmaking that are achievable with a smartphone. So the next time you're shooting, you will understand the implications of what you're doing. You will understand the mechanics behind those movements. Note, as I said in the introduction of this lesson, that most of the movements that we're going to be discussing in this lesson right here could be done in post-production. I'm going to teach you how to perform most of today's movements that we're going to analyze in post-production editing. So don't stress about having to nail every single one of the movements that we're going to talk about in this lesson right here. Enough of the introduction, let's move to the shots themselves. Now, as we said, these are 7 shots, 7 different camera movements that we're going to be analyzing in this course right here. We're going to be talking about the pan movement, the tilt movement, zooming in and out, the pedestal movement, the tracking shots, the dolly shots, and the following shots. Now, this might sound a bit overwhelming, or this may sound like a lot of information and things to discuss, but trust me, they're very simple, very basic, and if you take some basic notes, you're going to be fine with this lesson. So let's start with the tilt shot. Here is this camera. We're going to be focusing in this camera to help me explain what each type of shot is. So basically, in the tilt shot, the camera is fixed in a location. It doesn't move, and it just rotates on a vertical plane. As you can see, we tilt upwards and tilt downwards. So it produces the illusion of camera movement without actually having to move the camera itself from its location. The camera stays stable. This is what I want you to remember when it comes to the tilt shot. For example, this right here, as you can see, is a tilt upward. Let's say it again. The camera tilts upwards to reveal the subject. In addition to that, I want you to know that it seemed like there was movement in the shot, and there was movement in the shot. There was a change in the shot, but the camera stayed completely still. So enough with the tilt shots. Let's move to the second category of shots, which are the pan shots. Now, during the pan shot, just like the tilt shot, the camera is completely stationary. It doesn't move. It stays in a complete location. But the difference is that in tilt mode, we tilt upwards and downwards, and during the pan mode, we tilt from left to right. So the camera rotates in a horizontal axis. The pan shot is one of the most common camera movements you'd see in big films, and it's pretty much a revealing shot in which we usually reveal a larger scene. If we play the same video from the same movement, you can see the tilt shot here combined with, as you can see now, a pan movement from right to left. So this is how, for example, we can combine tilt with pan movement. Moving on, we're now going to talk about the zoom movement. Now note that this movement right here refers to the digital or analog zoom of the lens. So this is a built-in zoom in which again the camera stays still. Obviously the frames zooms in into the subject, but the camera stays completely still, just like in the zoom or the pan movement. Now, there are a few things that I want to point out when it comes to zoom movements, especially zoom movements with, again, artificial or analog zoom while zooming the lens, because we're going to discuss about dolly movements in the future of this lesson, in which we don't actually zoom with the lens, we just pan towards the subject with our camera. Now, the first thing that I want to point out in these types of shots right here is that when we zoom in digitally or analog with the lens, we have increased risk of zoom shake. This is what we call zoom shake. If we increase the focal range, as we call it in filmmaking, in which we shoot a subject, we have increased shake. So you pretty much don't have shaky hands, or you want to have your camera on a gimbal while performing those shots. In addition to that, I want you to know that digital zoom decreases the quality of your video. Take this for example. Imagine that you have a 4K video in front of you. If we start zooming in, we have less pixels in the image that is produced. So the quality of the image starts to decrease. After some point, if we zoom in too much digitally, we're going to have a very distorted image, which is pretty much not usable. So keep that in mind when zooming in digitally, which is pretty much what we will be doing in the post-production editing lesson. There is increased risk of a very bad image quality. In addition to that, note that when you're zooming, especially with an analog lens, the difference in the focal range that you're using, so the different lenses that we're using and different focal ranges as we zoom in, may distort the subject. So subject distortion due to zooming in and zooming out is very, very common, and we have to be careful with it. Now I'm not going to show you an example of a zoom shot. I think everyone here knows what a zoom shot is. So let's move to the next shot, which is the tracking shot. Now, the important thing to know when it comes to the tracking shot is that the camera moves at the same speed with the subject. So we have a shot in which the subject is in the middle of the frame and the camera also follows the subject along. So again, this gives us a subject in the middle of the frame and the environment constantly changing. Just like most shots that we have analyzed up until this point, the tracking shot is applied to reveal a scenery while having again the central subject at the center of our frame. As a note, remember again that in the tracking shot, the camera moves in the horizontal axis and not in the vertical axis, obviously. This is the opening tracking shot from Spectre, of course, the James Bond movie. And you can see that in the beginning of the shot, the subject is this person right here in the white suit, but then the tracking shot moves, of course, to have James Bond in the center of the frame. So this right here is a perfect example of a tracking shot. We have the subject, as you can see, in the center of the frame. The environment constantly changes, and if we move the video, you're going to see that this is a single shot. Again, this is combined in this part of the shot with some zoom in. Now we have zoom out, and again we track the subject and the subject stays at the middle of the frame. So this is the basic principle of the tracking shot. Moving on to the next shot, we're going to discuss about the dolly shot. We're done with the camera staying stable. Now let's analyze some shots in which the camera actually moves. The dolly shot is going to be the first shot of that category, and in the dolly shot the camera moves towards or away from a subject. The dolly shot is pretty much zoom in or zoom out, but using the camera, not using digital zoom in or digital zoom out, nor using like the zoom in with the lens. Now, what is the function of dolly shot? Why do we zoom in with dolly shot and not with a lens? The first thing is to actually apply focus to the subject. We want the viewer's attention to be in the subject, so we just bring the camera close to the subject. This, of course, builds up tension in a scene and obviously increases the drama of the scene. There is one more reason to use a dolly shot rather than just zooming in with a lens, and if you can recall, this is due to the fact that while we zoom in with a lens, we might have distortion in the subject. So with a dolly shot, we don't have distortion, and this is a great way to just cycle around this. Here, for example, we can see a perfect example of a dolly shot. The camera just moves towards the subject. This is very basic and very simple. One thing that I want to add here is that due to the fact that we have camera movement and the camera isn't stable, just like the pan shots or the tilt shots, you might want again to invest in an accessory, in a gear piece that stabilizes your footage. This is where we need footage stabilization. You don't want to be hand holding your camera and moving towards the subject. This is going to, of course, introduce some shake into the videos, so you might want to invest in some gimbal and some stabilizer of some sorts if your smartphone doesn't have, of course, built-in stabilization, as we analyzed in the first course. Moving on, we're going to discuss about the following shot. Now, the following shot is similar to the tracking shot, but again, the subject stays in the middle of the frame. The only difference here is that the camera doesn't have to stay fixated in a singular position according to the subject. So the camera may turn around the subject. We might introduce some creative freedom in the following shots, and this is what differentiates again a following shot from a tracking shot. Again, very, very important to use a gimbal and to not actually hand holding the camera while performing those shots, because we don't want to introduce some shake into our videos. Obviously, you can combine a following shot while being zoomed in. And if you actually handheld your camera while moving around the subject, while being zoomed in, because as we said, zooming in introduces more shake to our videos, this combination will introduce a big amount of shakiness to our videos. So I really, really suggest you to invest in a gimbal if you want to be performing those shots. This right here is a perfect example of a following shot. Again, the camera is fixated and we have the subjects in the middle of the frame, but the director and the camera operator has creative freedom to move whatever he wishes during this shot. Next, we're going to talk about the pedestal, also known as the boom up and boom down movement. As you can see, the camera stays fixated again during those shots in a singular position, but moves in the vertical axis. So the camera moves upwards and downwards. The pedestal shot, the movement actually of the pedestal shot is pretty similar to the tilt shot, but during the boom up and down or pedestal shot, whatever you want to call it, the camera angle stays the same and just the camera moves upwards and downwards in the vertical axis. This obviously helps us reveal new subjects in the shot, or helps us focus if the director wants the viewers to focus on a specific part of the scene that we wouldn't see otherwise. Let me give an example. In this film right here, while those two gentlemen are discussing at the table, the director wants us to focus on a different part of the video, let's say, so we use the pedestal shot to move downwards into the legs and below the legs of the subjects. Again, okay, this is very creative, obviously, to show this woman hiding in the back floor. So obviously you can get very creative with a pedestal shot, and this was just an example of how to use it. Now I'm going to introduce you to some tips that you need to know again to perform successfully the camera movements that we discussed in this lesson without having any problems in, again, the implication of the movements. First of all, you don't want to underestimate the power and the elegance and the beautifulness of still shots, just having a camera in the tripod and just recording an environment. These are very, very powerful shots, and I don't want you, just because you were introduced to all of those camera movements, to just completely forget about still shots. Don't underestimate still shots. The second thing that I want to point out is that you need to have a different variety of movements. Don't overuse a movement just because you love it or you're good at it. Try to invest time to master all of the movements that we discussed in this lesson right here and use a variety of them. The next tip that I have to give you is that it is better to achieve those movements in camera and master the techniques to, again, provide those movements than to rely on post-production again to deliver those movements. I want you to think at post-production editing as a last resort to correct some very basic and superficial mistakes that we did in the shooting process. So don't rely on post-production again to deliver those movements. Try to master them while shooting with your camera. The final tip, and we talked about this during this lecture, is to invest and buy a gimbal if you really want to apply 100% of movements that we talked about in this lesson. Invest the money, buy a gimbal. If you use it correctly, it will make you your money back, and it is very, very helpful to have one. So to recap, these are the 6 movements that I want you to remember. Obviously, we talked about one more, but these are the 6 basic movements, again, to perform with your camera. And don't be stressed by this huge camera that you can see in this slide right here. Obviously, you can perform these with your smartphone. We talked about the dolly movement, in which the camera moves towards and away the subject. We talked about the tilt movement, in which the angle of the camera changes. We talked about the pedestal or the boom up and down, in which the camera moves in the vertical axis. We talked about the pan movement, and okay, the track and roll movement, you can forget about it, is a bit more advanced. So this was pretty much it when it comes to camera movements you can perform with your smartphone. I hope that this lesson right here helped you elevate your videography game and made you understand that camera movements and videography in general isn't as complicated as it seems. In the next lesson, we're going to discuss about composition, how to apply some basic composition principles to elevate your videography.